In this lesson, we're going to learn how to create class variables and class methods. A class variable is a variable whose value can be accessed throughout all the instances of a class. A class method is a method that can be called directly from a class rather than calling it from an instance of the class. A simple example will make this very clear. Let's take a look at our name class that we've been defining in this chapter. What if, for whatever reason, we need to keep track of how many name objects are actually created in the course of a program? To do that, we need to define a class variable because we need a variable whose value is accessed throughout each instance, so that every time we create a new instance of a name object, one reason we can use class objects is to keep track of how many different names, for example, are created in the course of a program. If we just kept track of a count in the instance variables, then each count would start over again because every time we create a new instance, we create a new version of the instance variables. However, with a class variable, then that value remains the same, or another term for that is static, throughout each instance or each instantiation of a new object. So every time we instantiate a new name object, we can increment a count by 1, and that will help us keep track of name objects. To create a class variable, simply declare a variable with two @ signs followed by the name of the variable. So @count now becomes a class variable, and we probably would want to initialize it to a value, in this case 0, so that at the beginning of our class definition and before we actually instantiate an object, and then in our initialization method, every time we create a new object or instantiate a new object, we increment the count by 1, so that when we create our first object, the count is 1. When we create our second name object, the count is 2, and so on and so forth. So for example, now when that line is executed, we have one name object. Now we have two name objects. If we want to actually view the number, we could view the variable directly, or a better way to do it would be to create a class method. And then through the class method, we can see the count from time to time. So the way we do that is we begin by defining a new method, and then to make it a class method, we write self dot in the name of the method. And here we simply want to return the class variable count to tell us how many objects we have. So we can use that in our program down here. We can say print name count, and that's how a class method is called. And we can do it again below to see the new count. So let's save this program. Clear our screen. And so it shows 12, but it's actually 1 and 2. Let me add a print in here in between. Let's try that one more time. I should have put a heading there. There we go. So after we instantiate the first name object, our count is 1, and then when we instantiate the second name object, our count is 2. So let's review our code one more time. We create a class variable by putting two @ signs before the variable name. And then in this case, we want to initialize it to 0 so that for each subsequent instantiation, we can increment by 1. And that allows us to keep an accurate count. Then to display the count, we write a class method. We do that by our normal def statement, define statement, followed by self dot and the name of the class method. In this case, we want to call it count also to make it easy to remember. And then the body of the method definition is simply returning the class variable, which is how we get 1 when this line executes and 2 when our second line executes, or the second call to the class method count. So that wraps up this lesson on class variables and class methods. And now we're ready to move to the exercises where we're going to demonstrate in 3 separate exercises a little bit more about working with classes in Ruby.